Welcome to episode 90 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today we get to speak to retired agent John Terry, who served 25 years with the FBI. After a short stint in the Richmond office, John was assigned to the Philadelphia Division, where he developed an expertise in working international white-collar crime investigations involving sophisticated schemes conducted by organized crime groups from Eastern Europe. After a few years, he was moved to the Organized Crime Squad, where he investigated the Philly mob. In this episode, John Terry reviews his investigation of Ralph Natale, the first sitting mob boss ever to cooperate with and testify for the FBI. John also talks about his relationship with informant Ron Previte, also known as the Fat Rat. John Terry was later promoted to supervise the Organized Crime Squad. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, John Terry was appointed as the FBI's on-scene commander at the Baghdad International Airport in Baghdad, Iraq, where he managed 25 task force investigators from various federal agencies conducting counterterrorism and terrorist financing investigations. Later in his bureau career, John served as the program manager responsible for covert operations, utilizing all aspects of physical security to include locks, alarms, and video surveillance systems in support of counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and criminal investigations throughout the United States. Currently, John Terry is employed as the Global Manager of Compliance Investigations for Ingersoll Rand. Now, I don't know if you remember me talking about this, but I have been a little disappointed that I have not had a full case review about the Philadelphia mob. I've touched on it here and there on other cases, but I really wanted to talk about the Philly mob. I know this is my 90th interview, but sometimes it takes some convincing to get the agents to come on and talk about their cases. So I haven't been quite successful in talking to some of the agents who've investigated the Philadelphia mob and the Nicky Scarfo era. I'm still working on it, but it was so funny that I never thought about John Terry. John Terry and I go way back, and he'll tell you that story during the interview. But we also were on the same squad for a while. He sat in the desk right next to mine. We actually live in the same town. His son and my son were on the same basketball team. John was the coach, and my husband helped out. So why didn't I think about calling up John and asking him to talk about the Philly mob? He knew better than to turn me down. So anyway, I have to give full producer credit to my buddy Dave Schratweiser, because Dave had John on his YouTube show, Mob Talk. And that's when I finally had that aha moment, call John Terry. So thanks, Dave, for giving me a clue. And thanks, John, for saying yes, although you really had no choice. Before we get to that interview, I want to remind you that I am on my way, literally, tomorrow at 4 a.m. to FBI headquarters for a VIP tour. I will be taking lots of notes and, if allowed, lots of photos, and I will be stopping in the FBI Recreation Association store to pick up a few FBI collectibles and memorabilia. My plan is to hold a giveaway during the month of November, so who knows? You could be one of 3 lucky members of my FBI Retired Case File Review reader team who wins some cool FBI swag. An ornament, a challenge coin, a lapel pin. I don't know what I'm going to pick up, but I will put all the information about the giveaway and what you need to do to enter in my November monthly email about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. So if you are interested in entering that giveaway of FBI swag, look out for my November monthly email. It will go out a little late, but I should have it out by Monday, November 6th. If you're not already a member of my reader team and you want to enter the giveaway, all you need to do is go to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and that's JERRI Williams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up. I'll be sending out that email throughout the month of November, so you'll be able to find out how to enter the giveaway. I'll announce the winners in the December monthly email, and of course, I will email the winners directly. Now here's the show. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce my guest, John Terry. Hey, John.
Hey, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing good. So everybody knows that Philadelphia is known for cheesesteaks and soft pretzels and the Philly mob. You investigated the Philly mob for a number of years, first as an agent on the Philadelphia Division's Organized Crime Squad, and then you came back as the supervisor. So if I asked you a very broad question, can you sum up the Philly mob, what would you say?
Violent. A very violent group of men who regularly use violence to carry out their stated desire to make money at all cost.
Wow, that's a pretty descriptive definition for them. I do know that the Philly mob is notorious for its violence. Who was in charge during your 2 times that you were investigating them?
When I first got to the squad in '94, John Stampa was in charge. It was shortly after I got there that Stampa was indicted. But before he was indicted, we overheard on wiretaps Stampa discussing his wish to have Ralph Natale murdered. Ralph Natale was a longtime Philadelphia mob associate going back to the Angelo Bruno days. And Natali was serving a lengthy federal prison sentence for methamphetamine manufacture and sales of methamphetamine. And Stampa, recognizing that Natali was nearing completion of a sentence and was most likely going to be a threat to him upon release, was overheard discussing his desire to murder Natali. At the same time, Natali was working with Stampa's rival, Joey Merlino. Back in the 90s, there was a pretty violent battle between Merlino and what we used to refer to as the Young Guns. That was his group of guys in the mob versus Stampa and some of the folks that were associated with him. There was a violent battle for control of the Philadelphia mob. So Natali aligned himself with Merlino while he was still in prison, and Stampa, recognizing this, felt that the best move he could make is to have Natali murdered so that that would prevent him from being a threat to Stampa's control of the mob.
Now, you said that you overheard this on a wiretap. Was this wire on a person, or was this installed in some type of building or office that he would frequent?
The latter. The latter. It was a bug planted in a physical location.
Okay. And I take it you got some really good intelligence out of that.
We did. If you recall, I don't know if you recall this or not, Jerry, but back then we had obtained court authorization, which I think most in law enforcement and in the broader legal community would describe as unusual. And when I say we, I wasn't personally involved in this. This was a lot of the folks that were already on the squad. They obtained court permission to plant wiretaps or bugs in Sal Avina's law office in Camden. So the fact that they had enough probable cause to convince a federal judge to allow wiretaps to be put into a lawyer's office is quite unusual. And I think definitely in my opinion, and probably in most people's opinion who work in the legal world.
And how was that accomplished? I mean, what kind of evidence did they provide to the judge that allowed him to say yes to that?
Well, they had, in order to get a wiretap or a bug, you have to demonstrate that there's conversations related to criminal activity that are most likely being discussed in that location. And, you know, you present all kinds of different evidence to the judge, surveillances, if you have documents, informant information, other recordings that you may have from different sources, whether it's other wiretaps or if someone is wearing a bug when they're talking to them, and you put that all together into a written affidavit and you present that to the judge to demonstrate that there's criminal activity taking place, there's discussion of the criminal activity taking place, and it's taking place in the location that you want to plant the bug.
But what about attorney-client privilege?
Well, there was a big concern over that, and part of the rules that we abide by when we do wiretaps is a provision called minimization. When you overhear a conversation that does not have anything to do with the criminal activity or the people who you believe or who you name in the affidavit as people talking about the criminal activity, you're required to stop listening as soon as that becomes known to you. So we had to put great measures in place to make sure that we did not intercept any conversations that would be construed as attorney-client. Now, when I say that, if an attorney's in there talking about criminal activity, ongoing criminal activity with someone, that would more than likely not be considered attorney-client privilege material. Because he's actually engaged in discussion of criminal activity. But any conversations between an attorney and someone else not related to the criminal activity or to the people engaged in the criminal activity had to be considered as part of what should be minimized and not listened to. And again, there's a federal judge who oversees that wiretap, and every month you make a report to him. So the monitoring of what we were doing is pretty intense by the judiciary.
All right, so let's do this. You are, telling us about this intelligence that was gathered from this wiretap, and you had also mentioned that you had other members of the squad that were handling that. Could you kind of explain to us how it works on an organized crime squad as far as assignments and cases and who does what, and then tell us exactly what role you were playing during that period that you were on the squad? I'm going to sit back and be quiet and just let you kind of set the stage for us so we can get a good understanding of how this works.
In Philadelphia, there is one organized crime family, and at different points of time, it's been called the Bruno, LCN, or La Cosa Nostra family, the Scarfo family, the Stampa family, the Natali family. We eventually opted to just call it the Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra family. And on the organized crime squad in Philadelphia, the goal of that squad is to determine who's involved in organized crime, from the leadership, the boss, on down through associates, which you would include the boss, the underboss, the consigliere, who's the advisor, capos, who are responsible for running crews, different soldiers who are on those crews, and then associates who also may be working on those crews. So the squad focuses its efforts on whoever is in control or running the family at that time. And then depending upon who has sources, who the supervisor decides is best able to lead the effort, and sometimes who is just interested in leading the effort, the decision is made to assign the case to those or that agent. In my particular instance, when I got the squad in 1994, we began to wiretap or bug the store, a jewelry store that was owned by a gentleman by the name of Bobby Stone, who's now deceased. Bobby Stone was an associate of Ralph Natale in the Philadelphia family, and at that time, R.J. Saturno was the case agent on that. When I got to the squad, I was assigned to assist R.J. on that particular wiretap, and there's a lot of administrative work that goes along with doing a wiretap. It's not just writing affidavits. You have to correctly handle and maintain the recordings. You have to make record of how you're handling those recordings. You have to report back to the judge every 10 days with a letter as to what you're overhearing, and then every 30 days you have to seal the tape. So there's a lot of administrative work. So my first responsibility on the squad was as the administrative agent on that case to R.J. Saturno. After we concluded the wiretap on Bobby Stone, I was assigned to be the case agent responsible for handling an informant at the time, Ron Previte. Gary Langan was nearing retirement, and he was Ron's handling agent. The supervisor at the time, Jim Marr, decided that I would take over that responsibility. And as part of that, when Ralph Natale was getting ready to come out of jail in 1994, the decision was made that RJ and I would be the co-case agents on the Natali leadership of the Philadelphia organized crime family. So decisions as to who does what sometimes is based on who wants to take on the responsibility. In the supervisor's mind, who is most capable to take on that responsibility. There's a lot of interaction with the Department of Justice, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and potential testimony. So it's not just doing the work in the office or out in the street. You ultimately may be on the witness stand. So, those types of decisions or those types of factors all play into who's going to be the case agent on it. And then the rest of the squad, either in defined responsibilities or just ad hoc as they come up, may be responsible for different parts of a particular investigation. Someone could be responsible to coordinate physical surveillances that we use of the different mobsters and mob associates as we try to piece together their activities. Other agents could be responsible for dealing with informants who are providing information that we use as part of our case. And then other agents are assigned administrative tasks to make sure that we're properly handling the evidence that we're gathering.
So it's really a team effort.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just the squad. Typically, we worked with the New Jersey State Police, the Pennsylvania State Police, the Philadelphia Police Department, and at different points in time, we had members of those different law enforcement agencies physically as part of the squad. So they came to work every day and sat with us in the squad area, and then through them, we would coordinate our activities with their different respective law enforcement agencies. When Ralph Natale came out of jail, one of the things that we found out he was interested in doing to make money was making and selling methamphetamine. So we also had to coordinate with the Drug Enforcement Agency in regards to that.
How come there's I don't know if it's a rumor or just a thought that one of the things that the mob did not do was drugs? I don't know where I got that from, and I know it's not true because I interviewed Jesse Coleman about his case involving the Sicilian mob out of New York. But so they do drugs. They are involved in the selling of drugs.
Absolutely. I think that's just an attempt by Hollywood to romance the mafia. My experience has been that anything that can produce money gets the interest of organized crime. Prostitution, drugs, stolen goods, bookmaking, loan sharking, whatever's out there that can make them money, they're interested in. There's no, the old concept of the honor or the code of the mafia. That's just Hollywood. That's not the real world.
Good to know. All right, so Natali gets out of jail. Do you tell him that he is being targeted for murder, or does he just assume that?
I'm assuming that he would assume that, but typically we have an obligation whenever we hear or get information that someone is targeted for a hit, we notify them of that. And quite frankly, in the Merlino trial that took place in 2001, we were heavily criticized for those types of activities during the Stampa regime. There was an argument that we were partially responsible for creating the war that took place by notifying different factions that they were being targeted for hits. But, I feel, regardless of the legal obligation, I feel it's a moral obligation that if you have information that somebody wants to kill someone else, I think morally you're obligated to let that person know. Now, whether or not they choose to, take that warning seriously, that's on them. But at least we fulfilled, in my opinion, our moral obligation.
Once he gets out, how does your investigation, you're charged with the investigation of Ralph Natale. How does that play out?
So after Natali gets out of jail, we started gathering information that proved our concerns and suspicions were correct. We saw Natali trying to consolidate a power base within the Philadelphia family through Joey Merlino and the young guns, as we referred to them, who were not indicted and arrested and ultimately convicted under John Stampa's control of the family. And when we saw that was taking place, we quickly decided that we should try to focus our efforts on Natali. So we began to gather evidence that would allow us to place bugs and wiretaps in strategic locations where we thought the greatest likelihood of us gathering evidence to ultimately indict and convict the members of the Philadelphia mob would be. So those areas included Ralph's house. He lived on Cooper River in Pennsauken. It included the Courier and Ives restaurant and the Garden State Racetrack, and it also included his cellular telephone.
So he lived in South Jersey. He didn't live in South Philly in Philadelphia. He lived in New Jersey.
Correct. He lived in an apartment complex next to Bishop Eustace High School on the Cooper River in Pennsauken.
I know that well. My husband went to that school, and he also taught there. So,
and you and I both know it well because back when I was applying to become an agent, you made me run on the ice around Cooper River, and that's the same track that Ralph Natale would run on every day. He was a fanatic about working out and running, and if you frequented the Cooper River walk on any given day at around 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, you could see Ralph Natale jogging around the Cooper River.
And so every time you did a surveillance and you saw him, it brought those wonderful memories of when you wanted to become an agent, and I was the applicant coordinator in charge of hiring at that time, and I assisted you in your fitness abilities.
You were a stickler for rules, and you made me go out and run on the ice to ensure that my times fell within the required parameters set forth by the FBI.
That's right. Well, like I said, I'm so glad that as you're doing your surveillance of Ralph Natale, you had those warm memories to keep you company as you did that tedious and I guess that sometimes boring job of surveillance.
Yes, thank you for that. So after, so we made the decision that we wanted to start wiretapping or conducting electronic surveillance of Natali and whomever he might come in contact with. And that was based in large part to the outstanding intelligence we were receiving from an informant who recently passed away, Ron Previte, or as a lot of people referred to him as the Fat Rat. Ron was an informant who began providing information to the New Jersey State Police and then later to the FBI in the late 80s, early 90s. And he not only provided information about John Stampa and the John Stampa crew, but he was able to ingratiate himself to Ralph Natale after Stampa was arrested and Natale was released from prison. So we were receiving real-time, good intelligence from Ron about Ralph Natale, Joey Merlino, and the other members of the Philadelphia organized crime family. So through that information, the surveillances, physical surveillances that we were doing, we determined that the ideal locations for us to try and obtain court authorization to plant our wiretaps were the Courier and Ives restaurant located in the old Garden State Racetrack, which has now been torn down, Ralph's apartment on the Cooper River, and Ralph's cellular telephone. So R.J. Saturno and I, as I mentioned before, we were the co-case agents on this. We split this responsibility up and both began working on affidavits. And the affidavits at one point reached over 100 pages in length. So that shows you the kind of detail that we went into and were required to provide, which I would argue rightfully required to provide because completely understand that listening to someone's private conversations is particularly intrusive. So you want to make sure that, we have there's the proper oversight of that. So we were required to submit a great deal of information to not only FBI headquarters where it was reviewed, but the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. where it was reviewed. And then finally, after everybody signed off on those, to a federal judge for that judge's review and ultimately, in this case, approval. And we stayed up on those wiretaps for over a year. And what's important to know about that is that each time you get authorization to wiretap a person or a location or a telephone, a device, that authorization is for 30 days or as soon as you gather the evidence that you're looking for. And you're required to make notification to the court every 10 days as to the progress of the wiretap. And then at the end of the 30 days, the order expires. And if you want to continue, you have to go through the entire process all over again. Submit a new affidavit that's reviewed by all the parties I just mentioned before it goes to the federal judge. So there's a tremendous amount of justifiable oversight, but it shows you just how much is required of the FBI in order to get that type of authorization to build a case against whomever, and in this particular instance, against the Philadelphia mob. So we've got Ron Previte providing us with really good intelligence. We go up on a lot of different wiretaps, different locations, and Ralph's cellular telephone. We maintain those wiretaps for over a year as we continue to gather evidence. And then we ultimately decided that we didn't think Ron would be able to survive another indictment. And by survive, I mean when Stampa got indicted, Ron at one point in time was Stampa's driver. So he was very close to him. And the fact that he did not get indicted and was still out on the streets, in our mind, should have been cause for concern by those members of the mob that were still out there. But for whatever reason, they chose to continue to deal with Ron. I think that reason was money. Ron was an earner in mob parlance. He provided them with money. Unbeknownst to them, the money that he ultimately was providing to them came from the FBI, because we entered into a contract with Ron for him to become what we call a cooperating witness. Cooperating witness is someone who is providing information to the FBI on a secretive basis at the time it's being provided, but who ultimately knows that they will be called to testify or could be called to testify in open court. So Ron's cooperation was going to become known. What we decided was that we wanted to set Ron up as an earner for the Philadelphia family by providing him with money that he would use to pay tribute to the different members of the leadership group of that family, and that by providing that money, their greed would take over and would allow Ron the type of access that we needed. And
all right, I have three questions for you before you continue. First of all, why did Ron initially cooperate? When you talk about the FBI provided money to prove that he was an earner, how much money are we talking about? And the third one, I forgot. But go ahead. If you can answer the first two, then I'll hopefully remember the third one by the time you're finished.
In my opinion, what prompted Ron first to become an informant was that he recognized the value of having contacts within law enforcement in the position he was in. He knew that at any given time, what he was doing could get him in trouble and or target him for murder by the mob. So I think he was leveraging his desire to remain out on the streets. What ultimately made him, or what ultimately led to his agreeing to become a cooperating witness for us, was that he too, when we explained this to him, he also recognized that if we wind up indicting Ralph Natale, Joe Molinos, and others, and not Ron Previte, there would be no doubt in anybody's mind that he was an informant and then he'd be a target for murder. And the second part of that was his desire to make money. We paid Ron approximately $750,000 over a approximately 10-year period of time for his services to us. It was, it was a lucrative, he probably viewed this as a lucrative deal for him, and I would agree that it was. And I think, it was a good deal for all parties. We got what we paid for, and Ron made money and knew that he wasn't going to be arrested because what he was doing was at our direction and with our concurrence.
I have to ask this question because you cannot direct him to do anything criminal in nature, I would assume. So how do you go around that?
Well, you can. So if at that time, you could obtain authorization for an informant to engage in criminal activity. Now, not all criminal activity. I mean, we're not talking about murder. We're not talking about things that could have a direct impact on the everyday average citizen. We're talking about things like bookmaking. So we had authorization from the Department of Justice for Ron to engage in bookmaking, to act as a bookmaker. We got criminal authority another time for Ron to purchase stolen goods. So anytime there was criminal activity that was presented to Ron as a way to make money, and when I say presented to Ron, it was presented by the mob. Hey, Ron, we want you to do this or we need you to do that. He would let us know, and if it was something that we thought could, A, benefit the case, B, would not put any civilians at risk of injury or any other type of bodily harm, and was not so particularly egregious as to cause outrage, we would apply for and receive authorization for Ron to engage in criminal activity.
That's really interesting. I remember the third question I was going to ask, and that was just to give an explanation as to the informant role. You explained to us the cooperating witnesses, which I used a lot in my white-collar cases. The difference with the informant is that in the future there is no plans for that informant to testify or be a witness. But I understand that in many instances that's exactly what happened in some of your organized crime cases. Tell us about that.
So, and I was recently asked this question as part of another presentation. An informant, as you just described, Jerry, an informant is someone who there is no intention of them ever, their cooperation to the government, there's no intention that cooperation is ever going to be publicly disclosed. They're not going to testify. The relationship between the person who is an informant and the government is secretive, and there's very few people who know about it. A cooperating witness is someone who their identity and cooperation is going to be publicly known. In the past, when it comes to the Philadelphia Mafia family, cooperating witnesses, for the most part, were those people whose cooperation started after there was an arrest or after there was something that happened. In the case of John Veazey, they tried to kill him. And after that happened, he came to the FBI. So their cooperation was mostly historical. What made Ron Previte unique is that his cooperation with us was real time. He was meeting with on a daily, sometimes daily basis, but typically several times a week, if not daily, with different members and associates of the Philadelphia mob family, wearing a recording device during those meetings and coming back and giving us his thoughts, observations, and feelings on what they were discussing. And then we would take those comments by Ron and combine them with the recording when we'd listen to the recording to get a real-time view of what was going on in the Philadelphia mob family. And that's what really separated Ron from other cooperating witnesses who became cooperating witnesses on historical acts, not real-time things that were happening as we were gathering evidence. And that also gave us the ability to strategically make decisions as to where we wanted Ron to go, what we wanted Ron to do, and who we wanted him to talk to. And that really helped us build a case. We instead of us sitting back and just going along for the ride, we were able to actually try to steer the car a little bit because we had Ron out there acting as an agent of the government.
In a way, it kind of reminds me of the role of a UCA of an undercover agent as opposed to an informant. You, again, as you said, you're going to be able to direct them. And I take it in most instances, it's very difficult. We've heard about Joe Pistone and we've heard about Jack Garcia infiltrating the mob, but I take it that's a very difficult thing to do. And I wonder if we've ever been able to do that in the Philadelphia area.
We have, and Ron Previte was able to introduce an agent who you and I both know, Mike McGowan, to a Boston faction of the Philadelphia mob family. There was a mob associate in Boston by the name of Bobby Liuzzi who was associated with the Philadelphia mob family, and through Ron Previte, we were able to introduce Mike McGowan as an undercover agent to Bobby Liuzzi and his crew in Boston. And Mike was ultimately able to purchase cocaine from the Boston faction of the Philadelphia family. But that introduction of Mike McGowan as an undercover agent was made, that all happened because of Ron Previte.
And that information about Mike McGowan is out in the public domain?
Yes, Mike testified in court. That's all out in the public domain.
Very good. All right, I might have to reach out to Mike McGowan. All right, so tell us a little bit more. And one of the things I want to ask you is because we've done a number of interviews with case agents talking about their informants and their cooperating witnesses. And one of the things that is really apparent, and it happened to me too when I was working with different people, is that you develop a real, genuine relationship. Did that happen with you and Ron?
It did, but I would, and I'm certainly not trying to say that Ron was a child, but I would describe our relationship as almost like parent-child. Ron had some very strong opinions about how things should be done, and I freely admit that I have my own strong opinions about how things should be done, and I happen to like my way better than Ron. So we did butt heads on a number of occasions. I respected him for what he did. I respected him for the danger that he placed himself in to provide us with information. I think that he knew that whether or not we agreed on things, that I wasn't going to deceive him or lie to him. If I told him we weren't going to do it, we weren't going to do it. And I didn't try to justify that by creating something that would appease him. I felt that our relationship was open and honest, but it was challenging. And he'd probably say the same thing because we were both strong personalities. And, my goal was to gather evidence in a lawful manner that we could use in court. Ron sometimes felt that we were being too tight in what we would allow him to do. He challenged us, me, on a daily basis regarding that. And, there was some tension. But I saw Ron several times a week. So it was inevitable that we would become close. We'd meet sometimes at his house if it was convenient. We'd meet at restaurants. We'd meet hotel rooms. And it wasn't just me. Different members of the squad, back to the comments earlier about it being a team effort. When we met with Ron, there would typically be 2 or 3 of us meeting with Ron before he was going to a location where there would be mob guys hanging out. We would sit and talk to Ron about what the purpose was of the meeting with the mob guys. If there were certain things that we wanted him to talk about based on other intelligence we were receiving, we would tell him to bring these topics up. And then we would meet with Ron after the meeting and obtain his observations, because we wanted to make sure that if by some unfortunate circumstance the recording device failed, we at least had Ron's recollection of the meeting real time. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and all of that was documented I take it on an FD-302 report of interview.
Correct. The amount of paperwork that you create in an investigation of this time, you could kill a forest with the amount of paperwork that we created, and that's why it's a team effort. There's so much that goes into this. I typically was the person who would meet with Ron along with 1 or 2 other agents. We'd have other members of the squad who would conduct surveillance. They would watch the meeting take place, try to get pictures. So not only did we talk to Ron before he would meet with whomever he was meeting with from the mob, other agents would watch him, see him physically meeting with him, and document that, and then we would debrief Ron afterwards. So it was pretty intense, and there were a lot of people involved in making it all possible.
Now, how did that relationship between John Stampa and Ralph Natale play out? You're following him, you're listening to him. What's going on with Stampa at the same time?
Well, Stampa was actually, by the time Ralph got out, Stampa had already been arrested. So Stampa was sitting in jail, but we quickly learned that there was no love lost between the two. It was obvious that Ralph Natale, Joey Merlino, they were consolidating the power. Now that Stampa was out of the picture, they were consolidating their power and were firmly entrenched as the leadership of the Philadelphia family. Through, Ron's efforts, as I mentioned before, and the wiretaps that we had up, we were starting to learn that Ralph was very interested in different things that may or may not be part of what most people think the mob would want to partake in. And by that I mean Ralph had a union background and was very interested in construction and construction projects. At the time, the city of Camden, New Jersey, had just been designated as a federal empowerment zone, meaning that it was eligible for millions of dollars in funding from the federal government. Ralph, recognizing this, decided that he wanted a piece of that action. So using an associate of his and others, they were able to have a minority-owned business as a front for the mob, and they wanted that minority-owned business to win contracts in the city of Camden that would be funded through federal empowerment zone dollars. So Ralph used his associates, Dan Didone, Cesar Ortiz, to ingratiate themselves with both Jim Mathis, who at the time was a president of the Camden City Council and was also the affirmative action officer for the Camden City School Board, responsible for ensuring that the Camden City School Board was awarding contracts to minority-owned businesses in accordance with regulations, as well as with Milt Milan, the mayor of Camden. So we were working very closely with our sub-office in the Cherry Hill, New Jersey area, and the agents there who were involved in public corruption investigations of Milt Milan. And it was becoming readily apparent to us that Ralph was willing to bribe, provide gifts, etc., to both Milan and Jim Mathis. At one point, he had a jeweler, Bobby Stone, who I previously mentioned. He had Bobby Stone give a engagement ring valued at about $8,000 to Jim Mathis's longtime girlfriend. We saw Natali and his associates having drinks with Jim Mathis at the pub restaurant on the old airport circle in Pennsauken. And then ultimately Ralph paid a portion of Milt Milan's inaugural party after Milan was elected as mayor of Camden.
So that's pretty bold as far as bribery counts go.
Absolutely, and it got even more bold than that. We, as luck would have it, we were able to, from beginning to end, not only listen to through our wiretaps, but also physically observe through surveillance a series of events where we saw Dan Didone, who was a Ralph Natale associate, not a made member of the mob, but an associate. We saw him go to a bank in Philadelphia, withdraw a sum of money, and then immediately go over and go into Milt Milan's office in Camden City Hall. So, and that to me is a great example of the type of effort that goes into these types of mob investigations, whereby we ultimately use RICO as the federal statutes that we want to charge them with. We're able to build a good conspiracy case through a lot of different types of evidence. And in this case, we had wiretaps of Didone's cell phone talking about getting the money. We were able to scramble agents to watch him go to the bank and then watch him go into Milt Milan's office. So it was, due in large part to luck, but, it's that old saying that hard work creates good luck. So it was the fact that we were working hard as a squad on this, that we were in the right place at the right time and actually were able to see a bribery act take place from start to finish.
And if anyone wants to hear more about that case with Milton Milan, the mayor of Camden at the time, I have interviewed on episode 27 Bill Grace, who was the case agent out of the Cherry Hill Resident Agency out of Philadelphia, who handled that. So, they can also listen to episode 27.
Yeah, and Bill Grace was not only a highly respected agent, but he was a great guy to work with. We were in almost daily contact with Bill when we were working the case from the mob angle. He was working it from the public corruption angle, and it was great how it all seamlessly came together and resulted ultimately in the conviction of Milt Milan as well as Jim Mathis, although Jim Mathis passed away before he could be sentenced.
We hate when that happens.
And to me, in my opinion, and this is not meant to be disrespectful to any other of our law enforcement partners, but it's only the FBI that can put those types of cases together, because the FBI is the only organization that has the resources, the manpower commitment to put that type of effort over this long a period of time to build cases like this. Unfortunately, most other law enforcement agencies are fighting fires on a daily basis that they have to respond to, whereas we have the luxury of selectively targeting or selectively picking which cases we want to look at.
And you mentioned public corruption, and I want to say that, as an agent, having worked in the Philadelphia Division, that I think the two most elite squads in the office were the public corruption squad and the organized crime squad. And I think the agents who worked on those squads had, a little bit of extra swagger in their step because of how high profile those cases were. But it's funny how you have public corruption and you have organized crime, and in many of those cases, you were all involved in the same investigation in some way or another because of the Philly mob's influence on local politicians and city officials.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at, the history of the city of Philadelphia, back in the 80s when the Philadelphia mob family under Nicodemo Scarfo, they tried to bribe Willard Rouse, who was a multimillionaire developer in the city of Philadelphia. And Leland Beloff and other politicians were all convicted as part of that. And that was all as a result of the mob family's attempts to influence Willard Rouse. And then you go down to Atlantic City, which it's in New Jersey, but Nicky Scarfo was from Atlantic City. And they ultimately convicted Mike Matthews, the mayor of Atlantic City, for taking bribes. So the fact that, the mob has or is trying to bribe politicians to, for whatever goal the mob is interested in, that in the Philadelphia area, there's a long but sad history of that.
Anybody who wants to hear more about the extortion of that city councilman, Leland Beloff, can also listen to episode 70, because I did interview Mike Layden of the Philadelphia Division about that case too. So, you're bringing it all together in full circle, from the corruption side to the organized crime side. And I guess I'm going to have to reach out to the case agent who handled the Atlantic City case so that we can have details on all sides.
There you go.
All right, so where are we now?
At the same time, Natali is trying to curry favor with politicians in Camden through a minority-owned business to win contracts. He's also involved in methamphetamine. Longtime Philadelphia mob associate John Santilli, who has been a meth cook for years, he and another gentleman by the name of Ray Rubio are making and selling methamphetamine. And when we recognize that as an opportunity, we decide to see whether or not Ron Previte can buy methamphetamine from them. So Ralph puts Ron in touch with one of his son-in-laws and his son-in-law's brother, and they sell methamphetamine that is manufactured by John Santilli and Ray Rubio that ultimately Ron buys. So while, Ralph is trying to set himself up as a legal, quote-unquote, businessman through this minority business, he's also engaged in manufacturing and selling methamphetamine on the side. Unbeknownst to Ralph, he's selling methamphetamine to the government because Ron's the one buying it. And the thing that really was kind of interesting about this particular aspect of the case and really demonstrates the danger that Ron Previte was in on a daily basis working with us. At one point in time, he had a conversation with Ralph Natale about the methamphetamine, and Ralph says word on the street is the mob is selling meth to the feds. So somehow somebody was trying to piece different data points together and may have speculated that methamphetamine was being purchased either by undercover agents or informants, which was true. It was being purchased by Ron Previte. And Ralph mentioned this to Ron, with Ron not having any advance notice that this was coming up. And the way Ralph said it was that it was being bought and sold, bought by the government and purchased in small quantities. And Ron very quickly said, well, I'm not worried about that because I'm buying it in pound quantities. So he was able to allay any concerns that Ralph may have had that it might have been people close to Ralph by saying that, no, don't worry about it, Ralph. We're buying and selling it in large quantities. So, he took a situation that could have put him at really high risk in the mind of Ralph Natale. And who knows, Ralph may have said it to Ron just to see what Ron's response was. And he handled it very coolly and very calmly, deflecting any concern that Ralph may have. And there was another instance similar to that where Ron was, again, wearing a wire, and he met with Joey Merlino's and others at the old Avenue Cafe, which was Joey's hangout on Passyunk. And during the course of that meeting, a piece of equipment became visible outside of Ron's clothing. Luckily, nobody saw it except for Ron, and Ron was very quickly able to cover that up without missing a beat, carrying on the conversation. So, I think both of those examples really illustrate the kind of danger that Ron was in every day while he was wearing a wire for us.
Nerves of steel.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think, Ron was an interesting character. I think he actually thrived on that type of danger. I think he actually enjoyed the role. I know, if you talk to undercover agents and informants, I think undercover agents probably enjoy that risk a little bit too. I mean, they like the idea of being right there with the bad guys. It takes different personalities to be able to do that. And I have nothing but the utmost respect for those people in law enforcement that take on undercover roles. And in this case, even though Ron obviously is not a law enforcement officer, but he was still taking on the same risk on a daily basis. While Ron was involved in the buying of methamphetamine, he was also involved in running a bookmaking operation and meeting with Joey Merlino, Ralph Natale on a daily basis, paying them what is known as tribute payments. Those tribute payments were actually coming from the FBI. We determined what we thought would be necessary to maintain Ron's access to Ralph and Joey. And on a regular basis, we would provide Ron with cash that he would pay to both Natali and Merlino to make it appear as though these were part of the profits from a bookmaking operation.
How much?
Jerry, it varied in amounts. Over the course of the entire investigation, it was into the, thousands of dollars. I don't want to say that it was 50,000, but it was certainly more than 20,000. And these are the type of tribute payments that are part of that life. If you were an earner, as we set Ron up to be, if you were an earner, you were expected to pay a tribute or a portion of your earnings to the mob boss and to anyone else. If you're a soldier, it would go to your capo. If you were a capo, which in this case Ron was a capo, he was Ralph's captain in charge of South Jersey. So he would pay it directly to Ron, and then ultimately he started paying it to Joey Merlino after Ralph Natale got arrested. At the same time, he's paying the tribute and running the bookmaking operation, buying the drugs. He's also buying stolen property from different people associated with the Philadelphia mob. We ultimately received a tractor-trailer load of stolen bikes, baby formula, a much smaller quantity of jewelry that had been stolen. And this is all part of the wide-ranging enterprise of illegal activities that the Philadelphia mob or any mob family engages in order to make money. And once again, we had set Ron up as a guy who was an earner. So any opportunity that presented itself to us, we took advantage of it. And that is what allowed Ron to continue to have access to the people that we were interested in prosecuting, the leaders of the family.
Let me interrupt for just a second and ask you, how many members are we talking about? When we talk about the Philly mob, the Philly mafia, how many members? I know you talked about associates and everything, but I just want to get an idea. Are we talking 10 people, 50 people?
At the end of the day, when we concluded all of our investigations and prosecutions, we arrested and convicted, I want to say 43 people, and that would include Philadelphia, Boston, and South Jersey. And when I say, 43 people, it's not just made members. There are associates who were regular contributors to the various criminal activities of the Philadelphia mob family. And that segues nicely into another aspect of this case that presented itself to us while we were working it. Ron was from Hamilton, New Jersey, and he was very close with a detective in Hamilton, New Jersey by the name of Jim DeLaurentis. Jim DeLaurentis, his father, was the chief of police in Hamilton. Jim, one of his responsibilities as a detective in Hamilton was enforcement of the alcohol laws there in the town of Hamilton. He was the chief alcohol control officer. There was a bar known as the Choris, Choris bar, that was known to be a favorite of some of the farm workers down in Hamilton. And Jim DeLaurentis saw that as an opportunity to shake them down or extort money from them in order for them to keep their liquor license. So he sent Ron Previte in there to do the shakedown. We were able to gather evidence of not only the conversations between Jim and Ron talking about the shakedown, but of Ron actually going in and extorting money from the bar owner, which he later gave to Jim DeLaurentis. And again, we recorded that right from start to finish. The discussion at the beginning of the extortion plan right through to Ron paying the money back to Jim DeLaurentis. And ultimately, Jim DeLaurentis lost his job as a police officer and was convicted in federal court and sent to federal prison.
And that was something that just emerged from the investigation that you weren't even looking at.
Correct. We had no idea that this was going to present itself to us. But, Jim DeLaurentis, again, being close with Ron, brought the idea to Ron. Ron brought it to us. And after getting approval from the Department of Justice, we decided that it was an avenue that we wanted to pursue. So we allowed Ron to participate in this. And then ultimately, using the evidence that Ron gathered, we convicted DeLaurentis of official corruption.
So how does that happen? I mean, I take it you had to orchestrate that investigation at the same time that you were working on the other investigation, because this is a situation where Ron's identity is going to be known.
Correct. So working with our colleagues out of the Atlantic City office, and I should have mentioned that when Ron was involved in buying methamphetamine, and I believe over the course of the investigation, he bought 7 pounds of methamphetamine from Natali and his son-in-law and his son-in-law's brother that was manufactured by John Santilli and Ray Rubio. We worked with the Atlantic City office of the FBI on that particular aspect because Ralph's son-in-law and his son-in-law's brother were from the Sea Isle City, New Jersey area. So, it required a great deal of coordination. It was eye-opening when it presented itself to us. We couldn't believe how a police detective, son of a police chief, would be so willing to sell his badge by shaking down a bar. And fortunately for us and for, I would argue, for the people, of New Jersey and of Hamilton, Ron was the guy that DeLaurentis decided to use. So it put us in a great position to not only be able to get good evidence of this, but ultimately to take a bad cop off the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who knows what else is out there? It's really just frustrating and makes you so angry to know about law enforcement officials who are willing to conduct, criminal activities while they're wearing the badge.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, Jerry? I mean, what people will, what they will risk for, whether it's a couple hundred or thousands of dollars, what they're willing to risk, their reputations, their livelihoods. It's amazing.
At what point does Ralph Natale realize or learn that Ron Previte has been cooperating with the FBI, and what happens in that situation? Because I would think that, even if Ralph Natale is in jail, Ron Previte, life is at risk. I would think they would want to retaliate.
You're absolutely correct, with one very big caveat. By the time Ralph Natale figured out that Ron Previte was cooperating with us, Ralph Natale was cooperating with us. So for the first, and this is historic. It's the first time ever in the history of the American organized crime that a sitting mob boss decided to cooperate and become a witness for the government. Ralph got arrested in the late 90s for violating his parole. As I mentioned, he had gotten out of federal prison in 1994. He was on supervised release, and his involvement in methamphetamine and other activities violated his parole. And we made a decision in coordination with the U.S. Probation Department to violate his parole. When he was sent away to jail, he expected that his family would continue to receive money from the Philadelphia mob. When that money stopped, Ralph decided that he had had enough, and he contacted Jimmy Marr, who at the time was the supervisor of the squad before me, and decided that he wanted to cooperate. Now, normally, the FBI would not be willing to entertain the idea of a sitting mob boss cooperating, because he's in a hierarchical organization. He's the top of the food chain. But what made us decide that we wanted Ralph's cooperation was what we already knew based on our other investigations regarding Camden, that Ralph had tried to bribe and had provided gifts and money to both Jim Mathis and Milton Milan. So in our view, that tipped the scale towards, yes, we want Ralph's cooperation. If Ralph was only going to cooperate about those people below him, we probably wouldn't have decided to enter into a cooperation agreement with him. But because he could provide us with information to augment what we had already gathered against Milton Milan and Jim Mathis, we decided, and by we, I mean not just the FBI, but the Department of Justice, as you can imagine, the decision to accept that cooperation was reviewed and scrutinized at the highest levels. We decided that this would be a good thing for us to do. So by the time Ralph found out that Ron was cooperating, Ralph was already cooperating with us.
Did Ralph also provide information about Joey Merlino, who I take it is the heir apparent to be the next boss of the Philadelphia mob? Because that sounds like that would be a reason also to allow Ralph Natale to cooperate.
And you're correct. He did. Ralph provided us with information in any investigation, unless you have information in the form of interviews from those people who are directly involved in the particular criminal activity. There's always going to be gaps. So no matter how many wiretaps you do, how much physical surveillance you conduct, how many informants you have, there's always going to be little gaps. And Ralph was able to fill in those gaps as it related to Joey Merlino and several of the people associated with him. Georgie Borghese, Stevie Mazzone, Angelo Lutz, the group of people that we referred to as the Young Guns. He was able to fill in those gaps and help us round out. At this point in time now, we were actually starting to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office and putting together an indictment to indict the different members and associates of the Philadelphia organized crime family. And Ralph was able to help us fill in those gaps to build that indictment. And that resulted in arrest of all the different members and associates that were out on the street in 1999 on a variety of charges, which were all used as part of a all-encompassing RICO indictment.
Is this still the same time period where you are a member of the squad, or have we moved into the time period where you are now the supervisor of the organized crime squad?
So it's a little bit of both. In 1999, we indicted the various members of the Philadelphia mob family. At that point in time, I was supervising the surveillance squad, so my squad was providing support in the form of surveillance of the different mobs and associates to the organized crime squad family. And then when Ralph made the decision to cooperate, R.J. Saturno, who was still the case agent on the Natali investigation, and myself, even though I was no longer in the squad, the decision was that we would debrief Ralph while he was sitting in prison because we had the most knowledge regarding the case and what had been going on. So even though I wasn't sitting on the squad, I was still involved in debriefing Ralph Natale with RJ as part of the investigation. And then in 2001, when I returned to the squad. By that time, we had already tried and convicted Jim DeLaurentis, the chief of detectives in Hamilton, or the police detective in Hamilton, and we had the trial of Joey Merlino and as I've called them, the Young Guns, was underway in Philadelphia.
So tell me about that arrest, because, I know in Philadelphia, when there's a big arrest, sometimes, you just can't depend on the members of your squad. The whole office is asked for volunteers to participate. And so when you're talking about arresting up to 40-some people, I take it was one of those big situations where, everybody is called together and put on different teams for the arrest.
When we do one of these, what we used to call them a mob roundup, when we do a mob roundup, every agent on the squad will be designated as a team leader, and it's their responsibility to put together a packet of information about the particular person that they've been tasked with arresting. So they'll gather from the surveillance reports, vehicles, known addresses, etc. And then when we then put out a request for volunteers to help, and that'll come from agents and police officers, task force officers throughout the office. And each team leader will then coordinate with their team regarding who they're going to arrest. They'll conduct pre-arrest surveillances to make sure that they have the right locations, vehicle used, and then we'll designate a day and time, typically early morning, when those arrests are going to take place. Because of the number of people that are involved, it's not unusual for word to sometimes get out or leak, and it's also not unusual for us to arrive at a location and sometimes find the news people waiting there to watch us make the arrest. And that happened in this instance. There were a couple of people who we arrested that ultimately it was shown on television news shows of us coming out of the location with the person in handcuffs. That's just an unfortunate circumstance that comes out of having so many people involved.
I can imagine so, because there is almost a romantic relationship with Philadelphians and people who live in South Jersey. And for those who are listening who don't know about this area, a lot of people who live in South Jersey are from Philadelphia originally, or they work in Philadelphia. So there's a symbiotic relationship between South Jersey and Philadelphia. But we love our mob guys. They're like celebrities. And rock stars in a way, and the media in this area really spends a lot of time covering the different mob figures.
The fascination is amazing to me, to be honest with you, and that's where I think sometimes people in the mob and the mob life becomes romanticized by Hollywood and the media, when in fact, in my opinion, it's a group of thugs. Some of them are just flat out punks that are just feeding off of other people instead of getting up every morning and going to work like the majority of people do.
Now, Joey Merlino had a yearly, was it turkey giveaway or was it Christmas? He had a donation thing that he was just known for, and the media would cover it as if, he was a philanthropist, providing, wonderful donations to the community.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's giving away turkeys every year while he's selling, engaged in all kinds of criminal activities behind, in the background. I mean, Joey Merlino went to federal prison for 14 years after we convicted him in 2001. The fact that he gave away a few free turkeys, in my mind, doesn't undo all the wrong he's done in his life.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned when we first started was how violent they were. So during this period of time, what type of violence did you see? Did the mob have any, mob murders? Could you talk about that a little bit, about the violence?
Sure. So after Stampa gets arrested and Natali and Merlino are now in control, the trial begins of John Stampa and his associates. And one of the key witnesses in that trial was a guy by the name of John Beasy. John Beasy started cooperating with the government after Stampa ordered his execution. He was shot in the head and stabbed multiple times and survived, and then decided after that he wanted to cooperate with the government.
That's a good incentive.
Yeah, exactly.
A great incentive,
Yeah, well, he was shot with a .22 in the head, and it never penetrated his skull. So he decided to cooperate with the government. And the morning he was supposed to testify, his brother, Billy Veazey, was shot and killed. A clear signal being sent to John Veazey regarding his cooperation. But if anything, that just made John more determined to become a witness. There were other members and associates who went missing at various times, murders. Michael Avicoli has never been found. Michael Dutchy Avicoli has never been found and is presumed to be, a victim of a mob hit. So, the violence of the Philadelphia Mafia continues, all throughout this time period. John Casasanto was shot at his house, but this of course is after Natali is convicted. This is when Merlino is now in charge of the mob. So there are still several unsolved murders that are sitting out there, and I would imagine that the organized crime squad in Philadelphia is working on those cases today as we speak.
What would you say is the state of the Philadelphia mob today?
I would say that they are trying to maintain as low-key a presence as possible. It's an interesting time for the Philadelphia mob today because you have members who were in the mob on the streets when Nicky Scarpa was the boss back in the 80s. Members and associates who were on the streets in the 90s when Stanfa and then Natali and now today Merlino were in charge. So you've got a lot of mobsters and associates who are out on the streets from a 30-year period of time. And in my opinion, it is only a matter of time until there's conflict. There's going to be competing interests for money. There's going to be people who get their feathers ruffled, and it's only a matter of time until that type of conflict plays out in form of violence. And that those type of conflicts and violence, unfortunately for those who are victims of it, but fortunately for the government, that typically is helpful when we're trying to gather evidence and get cooperation from people.
So, John, could you tell us a little bit about you? When you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI, and were you always interested in working organized crime?
So I was a police officer in a small town, and one of the police officers that I worked with had been hired by the FBI. A couple of weeks before he was supposed to report to the FBI Academy in Quantico, he injured his knee and unfortunately was not able to accept the appointment to the FBI. He mentioned to me that with a college degree, why did I want to stay a small town police officer? Didn't I have bigger dreams, goals, etc.? And I remember coming home and talking to my wife Janice about this, and she was all in favor. She really encouraged me, and quite honestly, it was her encouragement that made me decide to do this. I would have never dreamed in a million years that I could have been an FBI agent, but with her encouragement, I decided to apply. And 10 months after I applied, I find myself sitting in Quantico wondering, what the heck am I doing here? And, I remember, I don't know if you recall, Jerry, but I do remember that they ask you early in your time at Quantico why you joined the FBI and what you wanted to do in the FBI. And I remember very clearly saying, I want to investigate organized crime. That's what I want to do. And, as luck would have it, I got to do it in Philadelphia. When I retired, I made a comment to the folks that were at my retirement get-together that, nobody's been luckier than me. And I think most FBI agents feel the same way, that no one's luckier than us. I got to come to work every day and do a job that I absolutely loved. I never viewed it as a job. And I don't think anything in life will ever compare to that from a professional perspective. And I think most FBI agents do feel that way, thankfully. I mean, it's the greatest job in the world, and we're the luckiest people in the world to have that opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that people don't understand, it becomes your life. We have families and spouses to kind of pull us out of that. But I think most FBI agents, if they could spend the good part of their day working, that, they would dedicate that time to the mission. So, thank God we do have, spouses and families that kind of put things in perspective for us. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I retired, someone said to my wife, "Wow, your husband's retiring from the FBI. How's that going? What's it like?" And I remember very clearly her saying, "He's just a regular Joe now. He's just a regular Joe." And to your point, any of us who have families, if you go to work and you're in, as we used to call it, your Bobby Bureau blue suit with a white starched shirt and the red tie. But from time to time when you come home from work or whatever, there's chaos. Somebody's hungry. Somebody's got to get to practice. Somebody broke something. Somebody, got the neighbor mad by breaking a window, whatever. And it just kind of makes you realize that you may think that you're all that, but in actuality, you're not.
So, John, I always like to give my guests the opportunity to have the last word. What would you like to say?
First I want to say thank you for this opportunity, Jerry. I think this is great that you do this. I think it's important for people to hear these kinds of stories because they don't know, for the most part, what goes into building cases in the FBI, the amount of hard work and the resources and the number of people that are required to build, as I said before, the types of cases that only the FBI can put together. It's a great organization. We have great partnerships throughout other law enforcement agencies, and I'm really blessed to have been a part of it for 25 years, and there's nothing that I will ever do in my professional life that will ever compare to it. So, it truly was an honor to be a part of that organization, and, my utmost respect to the men and women who are in that organization today, still doing the job.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of John with Ron Previte, several newspaper articles about Ralph Natale and Ron Previte, and a link to the Mob Talk Sit Down 4 interview John had with Dave Stratweiser and former Inquirer reporter George Anastasia. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. This would be a great time to give a shout out to my former Cherry Hill resident agency supervisor and Philadelphia ASAC, Bob Downey. From the very beginning of this show, Bob has always posted something about each and every FBI retired case file review episode. And I want to thank you so much, Bob, for spreading the word about the podcast. You're the best. Unfortunately, I'm going to make your job a little harder this week because I had to remove the social media share buttons at the bottom of each episode's show notes. I was having a lot of problems with my website over the last week, and what I did was just delete a whole bunch of plugins. So I hope you still share this episode. I hope everyone still shares this episode, but you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way by cutting and pasting the URL. Of course, if you're listening to this on a podcast app, you can share it directly from your device. I have a great crime fiction recommendation for you, The Dying Hour by Rick Mofina. The Dying Hour introduces Jason Wade, a rookie crime reporter with the Seattle Mirror, who covers the story of a college student whose car was found abandoned on a lonely stretch of highway in the Pacific Northwest. Now, I have to confess that when I started reading this book, I did not know it was about a serial killer. I try my best not to read books about serial killers and grisly, bone-chilling murders. But by the time I realized that the book featured some really horrific, ritualistic killings, I was so into the book that I kept reading. Well, I skipped all of the gory details. But if you like books about serial killers, Or if you want to read this book and skip the gory details too, then I certainly do recommend The Dying Hour by Rick Mofina. And while you're at Amazon.com picking up a copy of The Dying Hour, I hope you'll also check out my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. The book features extortion, sex, money, and more, so it's raw and gritty with strong language, and available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. As a matter of fact, in exchange for an honest review, I actually have promo codes for a free audiobook. If Pay to Play sounds like the type of book you love to read, please email me right away. The promo codes are first come, first served. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.